because I'm old, frankly. That's what it comes down to. Not getting any younger. Okay, the live stream is going, and Donna has a question. And if anyone else has questions, we can start with some questions.
Is Beth Israel a person?
Beth Israel is the name of our synagogue.
I know.
Oh, so what does it mean? What does it mean? Beth is Hebrew for house, so it just means the house of Israel.
Oh, very cool. Thank you.
Good question. Other good questions. All right, Michael.
Well, I have a question about the book. If I could, just from what we've read so far, I could spend the rest of my life exploring all those texts that were mentioned and so forth. But my question has to do with the essays that are contained in this book. The factual matter seems to be just very straightforward. The lists are a bit daunting, but it's very straightforward. But the essays seem to be very idiosyncratic to this rabbi in some ways, and I think he means them to be. And I was wondering what your thoughts on putting what he's calling essays in the middle of a book that really has to do with a broad culture and long history.
Well, I think that everyone tells the story a little bit differently, and the way that he has done that in the book is to try to draw a line between, well, here I'm going to give you the information, and over here I'm going to put my own personal spin on things, and that's one way to do that. I'm sure you realize in my talks you're getting. I mean, I honestly try to give the information as straight as I can, but I'm a captive of myself and my history and the way I look at things. And I hope a little bit of my point of view comes across. I like the emphasis on the idea that this is more of an art than a science. I mean, I think that science is more of an art than people give it credit for, having been a scientist. But I like the fact that he has these little personal reflections in the book. Was there a reflection that moved you one way or the other, or?
Well, okay, you on page 30, around page 36,
mm-hmm.
He said, let me quote him correctly here. He was talking about mitzvah. And he said, you just need to do it. From out of doing comes understanding. Now that's a statement that's on page 35.
Yes.
And that's I'm not so sure about that. From my point of view, I think understanding leads to doing.
That's my response to that is, and since we're talking about the rabbinic literature today, and I've been studying rabbinic literature for 25 years now, it was probably 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years in before of studying a lot of texts on a regular basis. I have read most of the Mishnah, most of the codes, a good piece of the Talmud by then. It was only then that I started to understand what the enterprise was. And I still don't completely understand what the enterprise of rabbinic learning is. It's one of my teachers said it's like trying to grab the tiger by the tail. You think that you've figured something out, and then you think about it some more, and you realize that your conjectures are just conjectures, and they're as ephemeral in a way as a pattern you make on the beach in the sand, or the waves come in and it washes away. So, I mean, at least in terms of study, if I needed to understand before I learned it, I don't think I could have. I don't think I could have made it. I think that my project, and maybe there are people that were smarter than me who could have done it in the other direction, but I'm still trying to figure out what's going on in a certain sense. And so understanding for me is really the lagging thing. But I think that other people, I mean, the beautiful, we say that there are 70 paths to Torah, there are 70 faces to Torah. There are as many paths in as there are human beings to walk on them. And I think we just differ in the terms of how much we want to proceed deductively or inductively. And that's and I mean, he's on the same page as I am, but I recognize that not everyone's on our page.
Well, I agree with you, but I think he's talking about all the rules and regulations and food and all the small, but they're not small, but all the intricacies of being a practicing Jew. And he's saying just do all of it, and then you'll come to an understanding.
Or at least you'll know how to do it. Okay. I think that in terms when we talk about kashrut, when we talk about living the kosher lifestyle and eating kosher foods and having your kitchen in order, it's the meanings. I mean, there's a lot of different meanings in the observing community about why we do it. Some people do it just because it's the national diet and they want to be Jewish. Some people believe that it's rooted in our reverence for creation and for animal life, and so that we're careful about that. Some people see it in environmental terms. The meaning, there's a lot of different meanings, but within a certain community, there's agreement about what is kosher and what's not kosher. And I think that is an aspect of Judaism that's distinctive. I don't know. I don't know that much about other religions, but other religions seem to focus more on doctrine, which is another way of saying meaning, that we do this because of X. And it's the intention that's definitional. But for Jews, I think it's the action that's definitional. And sometimes that gives people that are looking for the meaning frustration, because they want to feel something a certain way and they want to have that sort of direction. And there are suggestions that I can give for that. But if somebody talks to me about kashrut, I have a lot firmer understanding of what the rules are than even why I do them. And I think that there's some wisdom in what he's writing there, but the other side, people, I mean, I think naturally we want to have an understanding why the heck we do what we do.
Yeah, thank you.
So kind of branching off on that question. So the whole thing about Judaism that I've found is it's definitely like an intellectual pursuit. As long as you're, at least so far, it seems that as long as you're acknowledging God one way or another, you don't always have to love everything he has to say, be, or do. But as long as you're there and understanding it, then you're practicing some form of Judaism. And what's interesting to me is, but then there's this whole set of laws that you have to then follow to be a good Jew. I guess I don't know how else to say that. Sorry, I'm not Jewish, so I'm coming at this from a very different place. But that being said, it feels a little bit like, well, as long as you're questioning these things, you're in a good, as long as you're thinking about it, you're in a good standing. But then it says, oh, well, you should keep kosher. You should have, you should have circumcision. You should have this. You should have that. And my question is, well, how, if someone is actually questioning those physical practices, and they don't want to do one or more of those physical practices, does that not allow them to be Jewish? How, because there's kosher, there's all these things. How does that work?
So the community itself does not define, we don't generally define ourselves exclusively in terms of practice. And rather than good Jew or bad Jew, I think we would say observant or non-observant. That some people do the observances and some Jews don't do the observances, or some Jews are religious and some Jews aren't religious. That what makes us Jewish is our devotion to our people, and the community that we have. There's a common language that both observant and non-observant Jews share, if we expose ourselves to the education. The delicate part of it is then what's the threshold for entering? Because the threshold for entering is not always the same as the threshold for being. I think that the analogy that I didn't have brothers, but then the rabbi who made this analogy had brothers. But he just said it's just a fact that we're going to have. He had brothers and sisters. He said it's just a fact we're going to have higher standards for the men that our sisters bring in to date than we're going to have for those of us who are already in the family. That for those of us who are already in the family, we're already connected. We're going to accept a certain amount of questioning, a certain amount of variance, a certain amount of not observing, if you will. But if somebody is auditioning to be in the family, it's a little bit different. We tend to have higher expectations, and what precisely those expectations are for a conversion, I wouldn't want to discuss at this moment, but I'd be happy to talk in person with anyone that wanted to do that. But so we do define ourselves. We do define ourselves as a people primarily, and that's the question arises in this context is a little bit different. What are the requirements for joining the family? What are the rules for being adopted?
Well, I wasn't really even speaking to that. I was really speaking to actually just being Jewish and whether or not you keep kosher, whether or not you do those things within being Jewish, not being a convert. And also, I'd like to just speak to the fact that are converts treated differently once they're in the family? Those are two things that I think are very important to me. And we can answer this at another time, but I just wanted to throw that out there it was a segue after his question.
Let's leave that on the table for the moment, and when we and either in person or when we get to the life cycle section of this, we can talk in some more depth about the process of conversion and what sort of the pitfalls and how people are actually treated. How does it, what you're kind of actually asking is how does it actually work? And I'd be happy to have a conversation about that either in person, and we will talk about that in some detail when we talk about life cycles. So good, there's some chats. Some people wrote some funny stuff in the chats. I will start the screen share for the moment, and we'll have our little bit of a presentation, and then we'll break at the end for some additional questions. Just to see where we are in the summer section, where it's July 15th. This is our special Thursday meeting. The next time we meet in 2 weeks again is on Wednesday, and we're going to start the Jewish calendar. The last 3 classes that we're going to do are going to go back to the 4th chapter of the book in Dosek. We're going to, on the 28th, we're going to talk about the big calendar, the big picture. On the 11th, we're going to talk about Shabbat, and on the 25th, exactly 15 seconds before the high holidays begin, we're going to have a discussion of the high holidays so that we can get ourselves ready for that. Where I left everyone last week was this kind of difficult thing. We had just spent all class talking about the Hebrew Bible. What are the books in it? When is it read in the synagogue? And I left you with this, that the Bible is not the main curriculum of traditional Judaism, even though we are known as the people of the book. The Bible, as I said, is known as the written Torah. But the big thing for Jews, the thing that's at the center of our curriculum and the primary source of authority for Jews, is what's called the oral Torah. And very basically in this class, I'm going to explain what the oral Torah is, what books are in it, where they might come from, where they might not come from, and where you can find them today if you want to learn a little bit more about these things. The first sort of definitional thing, I always like to start with some vocabulary. And we talk about rabbis and the rabbis. Rabbis, there are probably a couple thousand people alive today that are called rabbi, that work somehow in the communal Jewish world. Since the time of the temple, there have probably been tens of thousands of people who were rabbis. A rabbi simply means master. It simply means the person who has some sort, who's invested in communal authority. But there's a group of rabbis, and this is where it gets confusing, that we call the rabbis. And these are the significant creators and authorities of Judaism. The rabbis are individuals that lived mostly between the year 100 and 700 CE of the Common Era. If you haven't caught on, if I haven't mentioned it, Jews don't use BC and AD because BC means before Christ and AD means the year of our Lord. So instead of BC and AD, we use BCE and CE, before the Common Era and the Common Era. So the Common Era is the same years as AD. The rabbis lived in this period. They lived in the land of Israel and they lived in the land of Babylon. There are people that, there are names that are familiar, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael, Rabbi Meir, Rav, Shmuel. These were the teachers and the editors of the oral Torah. These are people who lived in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple at the hands of the Romans in 70 CE. And the rabbis, and basically the rabbis is anyone who is known from the rabbinic literature. The rabbis were the authorities of Jewish law from around the year 700 until modernity. That all of the questions of correct halakha, correct authority, they circled back to these individuals and to the books that they wrote and that they edited. And this has implications for how we understand the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. I know that it's commonplace to explain the relationship as in this graph here, which is to say that Judaism is the religion, goes back into time, it goes forward. At some point, Christianity branches off from Judaism. And Judaism in this reading is sort of like an eternal religion, and it's kind of a parent-child relationship, that Christianity is the daughter or the son of Judaism. And this is the way that people often think of it. If you take the history classes I teach at the university, you'll learn a lot about why people think that and the consequences that this scheme has had for Judaism over the years. But it's really not the best way to look at things. And in order to understand what we're doing in tonight's class, I have to introduce an alternative scheme, which I think is the more correct way to look at it. And in the scheme that I have here, there's an ancient Israelite religion, a religion of the Second Temple, which lasts in the land of Israel roughly between the year 1000 BCE, and the year 0. And the main text that we have on this is the Hebrew Bible that we studied last week. Flowing from this ancient Israelite religion are at least two different religions. On the one hand, Christianity flows from this, and the Christian scriptures are derivative of the Hebrew Bible, the so-called New Testament. But this is a new religion that takes off from the ancient Israelite religion called Christianity. A different religion takes off from this as well. And this religion is called Judaism. It's the text that we are going to look at are the text of the Oral Torah, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. And the people that are responsible for promulgating it are the rabbis. There were no rabbis, as far as we can tell, in the period of the Second Temple before the year 70 CE. There's no evidence of the Mishnah or the Talmud. And so Judaism is in many ways a new religion, an offspring of this ancient Israelite religion in the same way that Christianity is. The relationship is not parent and child, but the relationship is really siblings. And if you want to talk about which one is older, in many ways, Christianity is older. The Christian scriptures date between around the year 100, 150 CE. The Jewish scriptures take form a little bit later. But which one is older, which one's younger, they probably evolved roughly at the same time in the same place. But if we recognize that both Judaism and Christianity are distinct and descended from this common Israelite religion, it helps us think of the contribution of the rabbis more appropriately. And it helps us compartmentalize in our mind this oral Torah and this literature that we're going to talk about that correctly. That this just like the formative text of Christianity come in the wake of the Hebrew Bible, so too do the formative text of Judaism come in the wake of the Hebrew Bible. There are two works that I'm going to describe to you tonight in a little bit of detail because you will hear them discussed over and over in Dosek, and you'll hear me refer to, if you come to services, you'll hear me refer to them. And these are really the true text of Judaism, the texts that were created by the rabbis. The first text is a work that's just called the Mishnah. The Mishnah is written in Hebrew. It's edited in Tiberias, which is a city on the Sea of Galilee in the north, because after the destruction of the temple, Jews lived in the north. And it's edited around the year 200. What the Mishnah does is it provides essential details of institutions that are described only generally in the written Torah. And I'm going to give a concrete example of this in a minute. The Hebrew Bible speaks in very abstract and vague ways. And it tells us to do certain commandments, but in order to actually do the commandments, you need some more information. And the Mishnah comes to do this. Also very interesting and very typical of rabbinic literature is that the Mishnah reflects the contributions of different schools, that there are different groups of rabbis with different ideas. And the Mishnah reports all of the opinions, both the majority and the minority opinion. And this is something that I think is a little bit unusual in religious literature. It's certainly different than the Christian literature in the New Testament, which are representative, at least on the surface, as a single school of thought. So what does the Mishnah, this book, come to teach us? And in order to give the most concrete example, I want to talk a bit about the holiday of Sukkot, which we observe in the fall. The holiday of Sukkot happens about a week after New Year's. It's a fall harvest holiday. And you know that it's Sukkot, in a Jewish neighborhood because everybody builds these little huts that I have pictures of on top. They build them either in their backyard or on top of their house or on their porch. It's like 3 walls and a door. On top, there's sort of a skak, there's plants. And we will eat our meals outside in these booths during the holiday of Sukkot. How do we know about how to do this? Well, it's in the Hebrew, it's been both the written and in the oral Torah. In the written Torah, in the book of Leviticus, we have the general instruction. And it says that mark on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the yield of your land, you shall observe the festival of Sukkot for 7 days. A complete rest on the first day and a complete rest on the 8th day. On the first day, you shall take the product of hadar trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And when we talk about Sukkot, I'll show you a picture of the lulav, which are these branches that we wave. You shall observe it as a festival of the Lord for 7 days of the year, and you shall observe it in the 7th month as a law for all time throughout the ages. And we get to the red part, this very important instruction from the written Torah. You shall live in booths for 7 days. All citizens in Israel shall live in booths, in order that future generations may know that I made the Israelite people live in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I, the Lord your God. So in the written Torah, we're given this very firm commandment that we're supposed to live in booths for 7 days, but we're not told exactly how to accomplish that. And there are questions that arise. I mean, what is a legitimate booth? I mean, how do you know that you're living in a booth if you don't know what a booth is? What legally counts as a booth for Judaism? How much of the 7 days do you have to dwell in the sukkah? Is it okay to be in there for a few hours? Do you have to be in there all day? Do you have to be in there day and night? Who is obligated in this commandment? Is everyone obligated? Maybe the men are just obligated. What about the men and the women? Men, women, and children? Do the children have to be in the booths? And what happens if it rains? What happens if it starts to rain when you're sitting in the booth? Do you just sort of sit out there and get soaked, or are you allowed to go back into your more permanent residence? These questions that allow us to observe the commandment in its appropriate details. These details are the task of the Mishnah. The Mishnah explicates and it embroiders, it goes into detail on all of the general commandments that are given in the written Torah. And we can do this with any commandment that we have. There are questions about how to do it that the written Torah doesn't give, and the Mishnah comes forward to that. I have here an example from the Mishnah that has to do with this question of Sukkot, and I'll just read through this and talk a little bit. And this is the first Mishnah, and it says, well, a sukkah, a booth, its roofing, which is the main and most crucial element of the mitzvah, that is more than 20 cubits high, is unfit. So we have a teaching that, well, it goes on, but part of what makes a booth is that it's below 20 cubits. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. And this is the striking thing about the Mishnah that I mentioned earlier, that different opinions are brought to bear. We have an anonymous teaching that says it can't be higher than 20 cubits, but Rabbi Yehuda says that's okay. But you don't just have a maximum height, you have to have a minimum height. Similarly, a sukkah that is not even 10 handbreadths high, and one that does not have 3 walls, and one whose sunlight that passes through its roofing is greater than its shade is unfit. And so we just start to talk about what are the appropriate dimensions that we need to build our sukkah for. But the Mishnah moves on to another question. What if I built a sukkah last year and it's still standing? Am I allowed to just use the old sukkah? Or do I have to build a new sukkah? With regard to an old sukkah, Beit Shammai deem it unfit for the mitzvah of sukkah, and Beit Hillel deem it fit. Hillel and Shammai are kind of the pair of original adversaries, the two opposing schools that lived in the ancient rabbinic prehistory. And they're seen as sort of the primordial rabbis. And the arguments that we have, many of them are understood to go back to these great schools of thought. I mean, they disagree. Beit Shammai says, build your sukkah again. And Beit Hillel says, you don't have to build it again. But what's an old sukkah anyway? It is any booth that one established 30 days or more prior to the festival without designating it was for the mitzvah of a sukkah. If I put up a booth for something else, if I put up a booth to sell lemonade, and it was before 30 days before the holiday, that's considered to be an old booth. In that case, the assumption is he constructed it for some other purpose. However, if he established it expressly for the sake of the festival of Sukkot, even if he constructed it at the beginning of the previous year, it is fit for use in the fulfillment of the mitzvah, even according to Beit Shammai. And the Mishnah goes on to say that, well, intention matters. If you build something as a sukkah, that's never considered to be an old sukkah, an old booth in the teaching of Beit Shammai. If you find this fascinating, you have, as Michael says, you have a lifetime of learning the rabbinic literature, all of these questions, all of these arguments. At the beginning of the discussion of these is the Mishnah. And this doesn't just provide information, but it sets the tone for all Jewish learning going forward, which is going to be discursive and which is going to be argumentative, that we're always going to try to understand the argument. We have a problem. First, let's sit down and make sure that we understand what the argument is, define the argument as precisely as we can. And then we're going to look for the source through the sources to see what we need to do and how the rabbis understood the argument. And hopefully we can figure out what we can do. One of the tricky things about the Mishnah is, though, it doesn't tell you who is right. The Mishnah doesn't tell you which opinion is the correct opinion. And we have a dispute here between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. We don't know which one is to follow. Rebbe Yehuda versus the rabbis, again, we don't know which one to follow. It doesn't tell us. We have a question from Sarah. Do different movements have different standards for how to interpret the Mishnah? Different movements referring to the modern movements of Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. Not really. It's a source of disappointment to me that the Mishnah is not a larger part of the consciousness of Reform and Conservative Judaism. There's when we talk about the denominations, one of the aspects we'll talk about Reform Judaism is they expressly set aside the oral law as authoritative in many instances, which is their right to do. I mean, their argument was that the rabbis in the past had the authority to decide what was authoritative. We have the right to decide that as well. The conservative movement holds the Mishnah to be authoritative, but it's not studied as much in the conservative movement as it is in the Orthodox movement. And that makes me, as somebody who presently works in a conservative synagogue, that makes me sad. I wish the conservative movement was stronger in its devotion to the rabbinic texts. In terms of how to understand it, though, there is not really a difference in terms of how. The difference is what level of learning should be devoted to Mishnah and Talmud, what level of authority should be given to the Mishnah and the Talmud. And which takes us to the Talmud, which I want to explain briefly. I don't have an excerpt from the Talmud, but I'm going to give advice on how to study yourself. And in the classes that Rabbi Barone teaches, there's always a little bit of Talmud in there, as there usually are in mine as well. But the Talmuds there's two of them. One of them is called the Talmud of the Land of Israel, or the Palestinian Talmud. This is edited in northern Israel in about the year 450 CE. And we also have the Babylonian Talmud, which is edited just like it sounds in Babylon in the years 600 to 700. What the Talmud wants to establish, I mean, the first thing that the Talmud wants to do is it wants to establish the text and the teaching of the Mishnah. I showed you a Mishnah, and I told you that in the Mishnah, it doesn't tell you which authority you have to follow. The Talmud tries to work that out a little bit. We have a different understanding of the old Sukkah from Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Well, which one should we do? Which one does the law actually follow? And that's going to be a task of the Talmud. The main task of the Talmud is going to be to connect the Mishnah to the Hebrew Bible. When the Mishnah appears, it does not give sources of how to understand it. It doesn't give proof text. It doesn't say why Beit Hillel feels this way and why Beit Shammai feels the other way, or why the rabbis feel this way and why Rabbi Yehuda feels the other way. And the Talmud tries to reconstruct those arguments. The Talmud tries to say, well, what really is at stake here? Why does each party feel the way that it does? And if we can understand their arguments better, maybe that can help us determine who is correct, who is more in keeping with the written Torah. But also, and the Talmud is an extremely diverse text. In addition to the commentary of the Mishnah, which is the main part of it, the Talmud is also a huge collection of the stories and the sayings of the rabbis. Everything we know about the rabbis, by and large, comes to us through the Talmud. Every rabbinical biography that's been constructed is constructed by going through the Talmud, finding all of the segments about Rabbi Akiva, and then putting together our picture of who Rabbi Akiva was and the way that he is presented in the Talmud. It is our main source for understanding who the rabbis were, what they cared about, and what their vision for religious life in the wake of the destruction of the nation of Judah and the destruction of the temple was. The Babylonian Talmud becomes, around the year 1000, the central text and the authoritative text for all of Judaism, that it's considered to be the project of Jewish learning to get one's to the point where one can learn in Talmud. I mean, the curriculum generally goes that you would spend, and because of misogyny, this would be probably exclusively men, but people would study the written Torah, they would memorize large parts of the Hebrew Bible up until the time that they were 7 or 8 years old. And then when they were 7 or 8 years old, they would begin to memorize Mishnah. They would commit large portions of the Mishnah to memory. And then around what we would call bar mitzvah age, the age of 12 or 13, they would step into the study of Talmud and then spend the rest of their lives going through these books. You can see in the printed edition, it's 20 large folio editions, probably close to 20,000 pages or so of things to look at. I mean, you are never going to run out of new things to find in Talmud. But the Talmud becomes the center of the Jewish curriculum. It's the heart of it. It's the focus of Jewish learning. And it's the foundation, moreover, of Jewish law from the year 700, 800, 900 until modernity. And it's in modernity that Judaism splits into denominations. And you have some denominations say that we do not accept the authority of the Babylonian Talmud anymore. And you have denominations that continue to assert the authority of the Babylonian Talmud in matters legal. So we have a question in the chat. Is a tractate the section of the Talmud or a Hebrew Bible that they memorized? The tractate tractate is a section of the Mishnah. There are 63 of them. 60, well, actually, yeah, there are 63 tractates, and so it's a chapter of Mishnah. And that organization gets put onto the Talmud as well. There's so a tractate is like a chapter or a section of the Mishnah or a section of the Talmud. Just another picture of the Babylonian Talmud. It's as big as it looks. And there's a page on a typical printed page of the Talmud on the other side. On that, the Talmud part of it, you can see there's a middle section. That's the Talmud. On either side, there are commentaries. And the commentaries that we have on our printed page happen to be written by French rabbis. The one on the inside is by a rabbi called Rashi. The one on the outside is a collection of French rabbis we call Tosafot. But the number of commentaries on the Talmud and commentaries on those commentaries is, it's finite because the earth is finite, but for practical purposes, it's infinite in terms of what, if you wanted to spend your life studying Talmud, you could either spend your life going horizontal and reading as much of it on the surface as you can, or you can pick a particular little segment of it and just go deep and try to read all of the commentaries and all of the possibilities as you can. The opportunities to learn is really endless. And the literature, as Michael said, the expansions of the literature that comes from this nucleus of the rabbis is endless. There are legal codes written in the Middle Ages that try to organize the legal materials of the Talmud into a handy and easy way to use. There are philosophical and ethical works that are based on the Talmud. The mystical works of Judaism, like the Zohar, those are based heavily on the Talmud as well. We read a lot of Bible commentaries written by rabbis in the Middle Ages on the Torah. And the purpose of many of those commentaries is to bring the teaching of the Talmud and the Mishnah into connection with the weekly parasha that we read. And finally, perhaps the most famous and most important rabbinic work of all, the most popular work in terms of the people that have access to it, the Siddur is a collection of rabbinic writings par excellence. The prayers that we say in the synagogue are composed by the rabbis. The commentaries on the prayers are composed by the rabbis. And in the Talmud and in the Siddur itself are selections from the Mishnah and from the Talmud that we recite every day alongside with passages of the Hebrew Bible. And the Siddur is like this this fantastic collection of Jewish writings through the ages, but the nucleus of this is the Babylonian Talmud and the rabbinic writings. Where does the oral Torah come from? Where did all of this stuff show up? Hey, look! I just showed you the oral Torah. Where did I find it? There are two traditional explanations for this, which are kind of opposite. That's the way it works in Judaism. We usually have both perspectives in it. There's a wholesale explanation of the oral Torah, and that says that the oral Torah was given at Sinai along with the written Torah to Moses and was passed on through the generations. So the Mishnah and the Talmud appear alongside with the written Torah, with the Torah of Moses in ancient times, and it's passed along. But there's also a retail theory that the rabbis have. And in this theory, the oral Torah evolved to settle ambiguities in the written Torah. And this is the way I kind of taught this class, which is say, well, you have this problem that the written Torah says everybody has to live in a sukkah for the holiday of Sukkot, but we don't know what a sukkah is. We don't know the requirements of this commandment. So we have to fill in the blanks. We have to settle the ambiguities that are found in the written Torah. And from this point of view, the oral Torah evolves, and it's created by the rabbis as we go. Both of these are traditional readings. Neither one of them is preferred on the basis of what the rabbis thought. There are academic explanations that try to make sense of this, but it's a very difficult field, and we know a lot more about the world that the Bible came from and how the Bible was put together than we know about how the Mishnah and the Talmud came together and the world that they are from. It's, as I said, I've been studying rabbinic literature for 2.5 decades. It was a decade or so before I had my own sense of what I was looking at what I was experiencing, at what I was reading. In daily life, when does the Talmud come up? It comes up topically if we have a legal question. If we have a question, is this sukkah kosher? If we have a question about kashrut, if we have a question about conversion, if we have a question about divorce or marriage, we turn ultimately to the oral Torah to determine it. And we have books and books of responsa and legal writings to try to make sense of how these texts can be applied. We have the weekly cycle of Torah readings, in which we also try to include the oral Torah in it. And we have a very nice class at this synagogue with Rabbi Barone, who teaches the oral Torah. He is on vacation now, but I think he'll be back in August, Monday nights so we try to match our weekly study of the written Torah with the oral Torah. And there's also something that has happened in modernity, which is kind of fun, if you want to try it, which is called the Daf Yomi cycle. The Daf Yomi cycle is a cycle by which the entire Babylonian Talmud is read. And so it's read a page at a time. And I went back and this is the page of the Babylonian Talmud on the screen. One page is actually both this page and the other side. The full page is both sides of the page. But if you read a page a day of the Babylonian Talmud, you can finish it in 7 short years. And this is the Daf Yomi cycle. And there's Jews all over the world are studying the same page of the Talmud today. There are online classes where you can look and see what people are studying today and what they are doing. And today, finally, if I was teaching this class even 10 or 15 years ago, I would have to say, well, there's not a good edition of the Talmud in English. Today, there is a very good edition of the Talmud in English. They have the Koren Talmud Bavli, which is an English translation of the Hebrew translation of the Talmud by Adin Steinsaltz. The Talmud isn't written in modern Hebrew. It's written in Old Hebrew and in Aramaic. So even modern speakers of Hebrew need a translation to navigate it. And he did a translation of the Talmud into Hebrew, and that's been translated into English here. These books are simply incredible. There's probably like 50 of them to buy if you do the whole thing. But if you just were interested and you bought a single book, it would take me a long time to work through it. You could probably spend a long time in a single volume of this as well. But between the internet and this edition of books, there are tremendous resources for people that wish to study the Talmud today. And so we have a question from Sarah: Are the weekly parasha things the same year to year? Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And Jeremy wrote a note. Have the Dead Sea Scrolls have any impact? I will answer that tonight. I will answer that tonight. And Brian said, Brian, did you do the whole, you did the whole Daf Yomi, Brian?
I did. I started, oh gosh, at the, what was it, 1997 when the cycle started again, all the way through 2005. And it was a heck of a commitment because I had military deployments during it, and the birth of two children, and it was exciting. And I was at the Jacob Javits Center. There were three. It was so big that year. There were like 300,000 people converged on New York City for the Siyum Hashas. There were people in the stadium. I was at the Jacob Javits Center. It was incredible. It was the biggest Jewish event I've ever been to. So it was
wow, it's a lot of Talmud.
Yeah.
I've started the Daf Yomi cycle a few times. It's simply too much for me. I prefer the legal and the philosophical writings, I think, to the Talmud. But I've done my time, but not as much time as you've done.
But yeah, some pages were a little more fun to read than others.
So Jeremy asked a question about the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what we call exterior literature, that it didn't get incorporated into the canon, but you do see evidence of those writings within Judaism in certain aspects. I mean, there's the sort of writing, I think, that shines light both on formative Christianity and formative rabbinic Judaism. There's not a lot of textual witnesses to this period, so everything that we have is really, really valuable. I had to do a seminar on the Dead Sea Scrolls at Penn. It was a lot of fun. But so that's my whirlwind introduction to the oral Torah and to rabbinic literature. And I hope that helped give some guidance to what Dosek is talking about and what we're going to be talking about through the course, because you're going to hear me say, well, the Mishnah says this, or we have a Talmud that says this. And hopefully this will give some context to what that is about. But I will stop here at this point, and we'll just have our unrehearsed conversation and questions.
A kind of peculiar but interesting fact is, for much of the time we're discussing, the wholesale approach, saying all of the Mishnah and Talmud and Torah were all given to Moses in full detail at Sinai. Well, if you subscribe to that belief, and many people today still do, there's nothing new under the sun. It's all been written, it's all been given. So quite a few authors, especially in the Middle Ages, who wrote very wonderful and creative books, would attribute it to someone else, would attribute it to a much older tradition. They would, the book would start out saying, well, I didn't write this. I learned this from some much older rabbi. To me, it's a kind of a peculiar tradition, because modern linguistic scholars can show that's not the case. It was a very creative work by this person, but they would attribute it to, they didn't make it up. They got it from somewhere else.
I like that you led off with the quote from Kohelet, nothing new under the sun. And I think we understand the psychology of that sort of conservative point of view. In modern Hebrew, we say, Masha Chadash eno chochak tov and Masha tov eno chochak Kadash. And something that's the things that are new, the things that are good aren't that new, and the things that are new aren't that good. That everything that was valuable, they would have thought about it ahead of time. I know when I have an idea that I think is new, I assume that if it's any good, somebody else already thought of it. Because how could it just be thought of now if it's any good? And I think that's a natural way to look at things. We enjoyed them because we're discovering something that if I go to a beautiful island and it's wonderful, it doesn't bother me that I'm not the first guy there. That we can I mean, it's a beautiful island that I'm experiencing, and that's the bottom line. I'm kind of I'm not made uncomfortable by the contention that everything that's good existed in some form in the past. It was maybe just shuffled and has come down to us in sort of like a slightly different form.
One other point that was raised before about reform and conservative. I mean, I think few, maybe very few, reform and conservative Jews have studied the Talmud or Mishnah, but they think of, the common culture, the common Jewish culture that they follow, the holidays, the customs, the practices, which originated in the Mishnah and Talmud. They just think, well, that's Judaism, and know very little about the sources of it.
Mm-hmm.
So when I go off on my, I'm sorry, Jeremy. Oh.
Yeah.
Jeremy, do you have a question?
No, I'm sorry. My microphone's still on.
So when I go off on my lament about how literacy is too low and Jews should be reading more, and why aren't they reading like they used to in the old days? What's wrong? People will point out to me that it's not clear how literate Jews have been throughout history. We only have the records of the literate Jews, kind of by definition. And we don't know that, we imagine that in the Middle Ages, everybody was studying Rashi and Tosafot, and that everyone had memorized the Bible, and that everyone had memorized all of these Mishnahs, because the people who left us books did all of those things. But the reality may have been closer to what we have, where you have like a smaller literate core and everyone else is just around for the kiddushes, for the fun. I mean, that could just be the way that it's always been. And people will, and some people will say that they can demonstrate that this is actually a very literate period in Jewish history. I'm convinced that's not the case, but I recognize that there's another way of looking at it than I do. I've just had it's been so good for me. It's been so wonderful to me to have the adventure of doing this. And I love the sense of adventure. I love the sense that there's always a field in front of me that for me is new and hasn't been cleared, and something, a text to wander around and get lost in. I find that to be so much fun, and I could just be psychologically weird, but I try to promote that to other people because I think that is fun. I suggest that people, they call it the sea of Talmud. My philosophy is let's go swimming.
Rabbi, the idea that you would have contradictory answers to questions and that are never resolved is extremely attractive to me. I like that very much, and that's one of the attractions of Judaism. And I think it's really part of the culture. Even members of Beth Israel speaking with each other. There's never a sense of one person having all the answers and the other person not. It's always conversation.
When we are at our best, that's what we are. And we're at our best quite a bit. So this is the end of my presentation for tonight. Just want to thank everyone for your companionship this evening. If you have additional questions, please be in touch with me via email. And I do get questions from you via email, and I enjoy answering those and sending those back. The next class of this will be in just about 2 weeks. We'll start the Jewish calendar. I hope everyone stay cool.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Interesting.